So, dear colleagues, dear friends, this is Sébastien Treyer, the director of IDDRI, speaking, the Institute for Sustainable Development and International Relations. You're in the conference called Next Generation Multilateralism, What Planetary Governance for Sustainable Recovery. I'm just here to say a word of welcome and rapidly present the panel for this first session that is trying to gather all the different expectations from different regions of the world about what needs to be reformed in terms of our multilateral system and our global governance. So I'm very pleased that many people from many experts and civil society representatives from different regions have accepted to participate to this session. In particular, I want to thank Melissa Leach, the director of the Institute for Development Studies in Britain, IDS, who's accepted to chair the panel. We are also extremely pleased that Pasi Mubalama, that Pasi has accepted to take from her busy schedule as an activist in Kivu, Democratic Republic of Congo, to give us a keynote speech in this session about what she sees as important issues on which global governance should, maybe Pasi, you will tell us how we should help you in your activity. You're the founder and executive director of AidProfen, a civil society organization working particularly on the rights of women, particularly in displaced people contexts. We're also very pleased to have around the table Mario Cimoli. Senor Cimoli is the Deputy Executive Secretary of the United Nations Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean. So no institution better placed to account for both the history of multilateralism, but also the vision from Latin America. Thank you very much, Mario, to have accepted to participate. We also have Amrita Nalika. Amrita is president of the German Institute for Global and Area Studies, a think tank based in Germany, but with a global reach. Thank you very much, Amrita, for having joined us. And I'm also very pleased to welcome Chukwumerije Okereke, who is the director at the Center for Climate Change and Development at the Alex Ekwueme Federal University in Nigeria. Chucks, thank you very much again for having accepted this invitation. We also have around the table in this panel Adele Thomas, director of the Climate Change Adaptation and Resilience Research Center at the University of the Bahamas. And we thought that it was very important to hear also from a voice from vulnerable countries. And Adele, thank you very much for having accepted to participate. And we have also Yixien Sun, assistant professor in international development at the University of Bath, who specializes also in global governance of the environment in general, but we have asked him to discuss a little bit the role and the vision of Chinese players in this area. So this is the panel that we have gathered, and I will directly give the floor to Pasi Mubalama for a keynote of 10 minutes. Thank you so much, Pasi, to have accepted our invitation. I know that it's very complicated to both work on the ground and discuss with us about global governance, but this is something that we are very grateful that you have accepted to do. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Sebastian, for the floor. And hi, everyone. My name is, as Sebastian said, and I'm a human rights activist based in Goma in the Democratic Republic of Congo. First of all, I'm really grateful to be part of this conference. I think it's a very important conference for all of us as we are discussing the need for global cooperation between countries. Whenever I travel in different countries and say that I come from the Democratic Republic of Congo, especially from the Eastern Congo, some people ask me if I have also been a victim of sexual violence. And sometimes I laugh and say, no, I'm not. I'm a very strong and brilliant woman who work a lot and contribute in the development of my country. The Democratic Republic of Congo and the eastern part where I come from has been described as one of the richest countries in the world in terms of natural resources, as we have on coltan, you know, all those kind of natural resources and minerals. But also, the DRC has been described as the rape capital of the world, and the prevalence and the intensity of all forms of crimes against humanity, sexual and gender-based violence, especially in the Eastern Congo. And for human rights activists, growing up in conflict has given me the kind of courage that no one can imagine, because, you know, I have witnessed poverty, gender inequality, sexual harassment, human rights violations, rape, killing, murder, children in the streets, this destruction all around me, and all consequences that come with war, which has led some of my peers to lose hope. I've seen war firsthand, and my work as a human rights activist has exposed me to the misery and the atrocity of community. And since then, you know, I try to work to make sure that the voice of the voiceless can be heard at different levels, at the national, even the international level. As today we are talking about the cooperation in countries, I think it's very important to see the responsibility of all those countries when, you know, we can see in Congo people who are dying every day because of the conflict in the region. The DRC counts today more than 100 armed rebel groups, which are responsible of so many human rights violations. And I think when we are talking about cooperation, we need to think about all of this issue, especially when we have to put a human being on the first on the table and see how we can really cooperate, but also to see the benefits, you know, we can get from all the action. You know, in the DRC we have the Virunga National Park, which is really very, very important today in the world in terms of the protection of the environment. But in the same time, in the Virunga National Park, there are still all those armed rebel groups which are responsible of so many human rights violations. And I think we cannot talk about cooperation when we still have like developed countries and underdeveloped countries. So for me, the cooperation is also the way that we can find the benefits from each part, you know. And yeah, I think this conference will be like a very important opportunity to discuss this cooperation, but to see how we can put the human being on first. We can put human being as the priority for all our action, and how we can still continue doing what we are doing by human rights. Because I can say problems in Congo, but we have seen with the corona pandemic that we are also we are all affected by different situations in the same way. And for me, the cooperation is like the most important thing we have to do by not only having like country underdeveloped and developed countries, but, you know, working together and see how we can face those global problems we are having today in the world. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Pasi, for this testimony and these very important words. I directly hand the floor over Belisa. Just to mention that, Pasi, I think you have accepted to also come back at the end of our conference to report on one or two of the key messages that you have received during the conference. And I think it's very important that we keep the relation with your generation and your action on the ground to see if we are really trying to go in the right direction. Melissa, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. So thank you, Sebastian. Thank you, all of the panel members. Thank you, IDDRI, for inviting me to chair this really important session. And thank you to Pasi for giving us such a wonderful starting point. So the focus of this opening session for a conference that really is very timely is how do we reform multilateralism to make sustainable development a reality? And I think, as we've just heard from our opening keynote statement, this really couldn't be more timely or important at a time where we've got this kind of coming together of multiple crises, of environment and climate change, of inequality, of conflict, and of a pandemic. And I think to reflect on how and why multilateralism can help us address these interlinked challenges, doing so in an inclusive way, I'm going to suggest, is really incredibly important, involving diverse voices and perspectives. So the kinds of perhaps more grassroots view that we've just heard is critical. And I'm also delighted that we have such a diverse panel this afternoon. So just a very few opening remarks as to how I come at this. So I direct the Institute of Development Studies based in the UK, but very much globally oriented. We've been thinking about development and sustainable development and how we can forge mutual learning partnerships to address it for a very long time. And my own work has followed global health and global sustainability challenges across Africa and other parts of the world. And it strikes me that actually this very week couldn't be a more timely moment for IDDRI to be holding this conference. We've got the COP15 on biodiversity meeting. We've got preparations for COP26 around climate change in my own country ramping up. We've got evidence mounting around the world of unsupportable pressures on the planetary life support systems that we all depend on. Climate's changing fast. Everyone's feeling effects in extreme weather events and fires and floods. The IPCC's August report was touted by the head of the UN as a code red for humanity, with alarm bells ringing now really loudly. I think we're seeing what one might call an assault on human natures, non-human natures, leading to some really precipitous declines in biodiversity. And of course, planetary health is under deepening threat. And as the pandemic underlines, as we destroy ecologies, so zoonotic diseases become a greater risk. And we're in a situation where most of the world's economies are on really fundamentally quite unsustainable paths. But I think what has always bothered me most about this, and I think as we have also just heard from Pasi, is that the effects are felt so unevenly. We're not just seeing the brunt of planetary problems often being felt by people who are already poorer, living in marginalization, but all kinds of inequities are evident and deepening. In the gaps, for instance, between those primarily responsible and those feeling the effects, in the shares of what one might call ecological space taken up by different countries, different social groups, inabilities to share decisions, and avoid scenarios like green futures for some translating into green grabs for others, as their lands are privatized and financialized, perhaps to meet offsets elsewhere, and inequities in knowledge and voice, with local knowledge, citizen knowledge often marginalized. And of course, there are shared structural and political economic conditions that create at the same time both sustainability crises and inequality crises. So I think we'd all agree that what we're kind of looking for is transformative pathways, one might put it, that move the world into a space that I tend to call equitable sustainability, moving up to and beyond the 2030 deadline for the SDGs. And I think we know that that transformation needs in part to be bottom up. It needs to build from people's real perspectives and experiences and from the grassroots. But it does also need to be top down so that we can ensure that there's regulation of capitalism's more problematic excesses, and we can get the transformations in economies and in cooperation that we need. This means challenging power relations, and it means charting them anew. So I think we've seen all of these issues almost magnified even further through the COVID crisis, which has fundamentally exposed cracks in the social, the economic, and the environmental systems that we all depend on. It's revealed and it's heightened inequalities, and it's underscored the importance of solidarities, both those very local ones and global ones. And I think, as Pasi's also emphasized to us, it's underscored the really catastrophic failure of an every country for itself approach, whether to public health or now to other things, where we're actually seeing a bit of an every country for itself approach in the lead up to the climate conference. So I think we're in a world where coordination has never been so needed, but perhaps it's also never been so lacking. On the other hand, is crisis, this mix of crises, also an opportunity for some fundamental rethinking of development and how we want to achieve it? So thinking about today's session and the questions we want to address, it seems that global solidarity and something that one might call effective democratic global governance is quite critical to the transformations we need. And yet the existing multilateral system is wanting, perhaps, in a number of respects. And I'm sure we'll hear more about those and others from our panel members. But some of those that I would just point to are some fairly evident flaws in the UN system, ranging from the powerlessness of the UN Charter, which doesn't really provide enforceable law, the fairly limited power of the UN General Assembly, to some of its deeper inequities in its organization. So we often see UN agencies dominated by the world's largest economies, or indeed the General Assembly, by a situation where tiny states and large states alike have only one vote, and where the Security Council often locks in real control of UN decision-making by a small group of post-war powers. Perhaps part of the problem is that very basis of our current dominant multilateral system in a Westphalian system of sovereign states. Perhaps that means that it's actually quite difficult to take seriously the rights and voices of people who may not feel themselves to be represented by democratic national governments. And maybe that means we're ignoring important translocal solidarities, maybe those of forest people or slum dwellers movements across the world, or gender activist movements which unite people in different countries. And so I think there's a lot of discussion, and I'm sure we'll hear more about it in this panel, about the possibility of UN system reform and how that might take. Others, though, are looking to alternative imaginations that might be based on strengthening the power of regional governance, or of networks or forms of South-South cooperation, or indeed to perhaps more localized, more anarchic solidarities, which need to be coordinated in some way globally, or even to the idea of an Earth constitution, something that might provide real enforceable law for the planet as a whole, an idea that's been around since the 70s, but there's a kind of growing recognition that maybe its time might now have come. So I think this panel offers us a really good opportunity to open this conference by hearing a variety of articulations of both what the problem is and ideas for how to move forward. So I'm going now to open up to our panel. We're going to hear from all 5 of them in turn around their take on the questions about what really is wanted now from a multilateral system or systems. What should be the guiding principles, and how might we achieve that vision? So they've got 10 minutes each, and there are 5 of them. So please, as you listen, keep your questions and comments in mind, because then I hope we will open up to a Q&A session, and then we'll go back to the panel in a conversation about these super critical issues. So without further ado, I'm going to now call on our first panelist, who will be Mario Cimoli. So Mario, over to you.
Thank you very much, Melissa. It's a pleasure to have you. And thank you for the invitation for ECLAC. It's a pleasure to be here. I want to be very directly my ideas that here in ECLAC has to be, of course, about multilateral, a new multilateral system. But I want to be a little bit politically incorrect, because if we say we want a multilateral system where human beings have to be considered, human rights have to be considered, equality has to be considered, sustainable, beautiful work has to be considered. It's very nice, at words that stay very good in our perspective of new multilateral system. But I think we have to be to understand literally and to go more deeper in the analysis, because we have to understand what have produced these enormous differences. We continues to have this level of poverty, inequality, access to financial development, and so on and so on and so on. And I want to take clearly to tackle this point. We want to have a multilateral system where you can building up in very political correct and you say all of these nice words, that is fine. But we have to understand that the multilateral system in the last years, in the last 50 years, more than that, part of it, they have a very good capabilities to pace and so on and so on. But this multilateral system has a basis in asymmetrical system. An asymmetrical system, clearly what are the main difference that explain capability, richness, growth, development, and so on. I want to take this asymmetry, and the idea is we can build a new multilateral system that could have to contain this asymmetry term, or what we have our idea to say the multilateral, but we need to transform this asymmetrical view and transform this asymmetrical view to favor for a long time the most the countries that need more equality and more progressive policies. This asymmetry we have to take clear. Take the case of sustainability. The case of sustainability, we want a very nice world, very sustainable, and so on and so on. But what is the responsibility, historic of sustainability? Is for developing world, or is more for developed one? If I came from Germany to the United States, I say, no, you Latin America, you have transformed your production system because that is important. Of course, we understand sustainability is crucial, but how we take clear this as historical depth and sustainability actions? Because the question that we have today is clearly a historical process. This is one. The second one, access to financial system. The access to financial system is building up on the capability and a distribution that gives favor to more developed economies. The developed economy make enormous advantage, but this advantage was based on this asymmetrical system. Take another important point about the capability of intellectual property rights. Intellectual property rights produce this asymmetry. We take clear this case in the vaccine history and the diplomacy of vaccine. We take clearly this point. I put in another issue that is important: the capabilities and access technology around the world. This is another important asymmetry. What I want to say, trade. Take the case of trade and the capability. This multilateral system that you read in this level, very level that is in the seminars, in the political correct and so on, say we want this nice world. But this asymmetrical process is creating about distribution and asymmetrical distribution of power. And this is very important. And when we think about the new multilateral system, we want to build a new multilateral system with the good, nice words, build up this multilateral system about more symmetry or some kind of asymmetry that give more favor policy to developing economies. That is the point. Because if we don't understand this enormous process that is behind in this level that explain distribution of power, richness, productivity, trade, intellectual property right, clearly we are only to be words and words. That is an important point. Now, if we come to elaborate it about the system today, it's a multilateral system that has positive impact in peace and so on, and the capability to create this world that live together, but was creating also in basis of these asymmetries. I want to say asymmetries in trade, in production, in technology, in what is construction, for example, all off of the distribution of power of large multinational firms, the capability to have important differences in the intervention in the financial system, and the capability of multilateral firms that have an enormous capability to attract profit on the areas of more developed economy. Now, what I said, multilateral system was based on this asymmetry. How we transform multilateral? Because we say everyone I want to say today, I want to transform it, multilateral system, got to be on peace, human being. But how has to be this base of new multilateral system? This is my point. We have to transform this as that was basis in favor of some part of the world, has to be transformed in asymmetry that for a long period of time is going to be support development, capabilities, industry, technology, human rights, of course, but give this possibility for the more developing developing economies and middle income economies to transform their production structure and to have a more access to the people, to good jobs, good skills, good capability, and don't have this case of informality. Take one, how we can transform this multilateral system if we have in Latin America, for example, more of the 50% of people stay in the sector with low productivity, low capability and skill, low capability to access to the trade, and so on and so on and so on. It's impossible. Although when we speak about sustainability, how I explain to these people, no, you don't take, because you have to be sustainable. But I want to eat. You have to be sustainable. No, it's impossible. This we have to be very politically incorrect on that and say we need a transformation that is clearly what is the multilateral system based on the transformation of this asymmetrical effect. This asymmetrical effect produces gaps in productivity, gaps in access to labor market, gaps in distribution of power, and so on and so on. Now, the issue is how we building up a new system. A new system have to be based on more. I say we need a form. I want to be provocative in that sense, but we need a multilateral system have to be supported an asymmetrical system, but in another way, in different perspective. Have to be support these areas of the world, because these areas of the world, enormous gap, this enormous asymmetry have to be corrected, but it can be corrected alone. They need cooperation, and this cooperation is a cooperation that have to be supported multilateral, new multilateral system. I want to say it clearly, and I think it have to be based on, for example, of clearly was the case of vaccines. Vaccines today, we don't have are arriving vaccine in different areas of the world. But what showed clearly this is enormous asymmetry. At the end of the history, they are the red light that say asymmetries. And that is only what is behind that is the enormous process of asymmetry in different sides of the economy and social society. Now, we need to transform. Transform in which way? Rethinking about tri-system that is more fair for developing economy, giving the possibility to access to market, have to be more access to intellectual property rights. Where there is a waiver, not only waiver to have a very easy access to intellectual property, it was vaccines. We need more intellectual possibility cooperation between developing and developing economy. Clear middle income countries is a case of that. We can go deeper in Latin America to understand. Saying what is another issue that have to be important? Trade is an enormous variable, because at the end of history you say I want to be nice, I want to be, but trade created this asymmetric advantage, and so on have to be rethinking in favor of this society. And another crucial important point to sustainability, because developing economy, middle income countries economy need to rethink about sustainability in a very clear way to support the capability, technological capability in this region to have and to reduce the emission of CO2. Now, this is important. Now, concluding that, and for me it's important, if we transform multilateral, we need to rethink another way of asymmetry. And another way of symmetry, supporting developing economies, income economy, that is very important. And For a long period of time, we need that. At the end of history, the world has to be very symmetric. But to have a world that is very symmetric is the way that we want to arrive. But if we want to say we want a symmetrical world with this asymmetry, principle that support this asymmetry, is very difficult to have that. I don't think it's important to go more deeper in this analysis. I want to repeat and conclude with that. We have to rethink at trade, intellectual property, financing for development, access to human rights, access to a new policy, a symmetrical policy for immigration. Only if we transform that, also, it's difficult to say, for example, to the United States, Europe, and part of Asia, say, you have to give distribution of power. The people say, yes, 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 in this seminar. But at the end of history, nothing happened. You know, it is important to understand that this system that created very good thing has to be transformed in some asymmetrical system, but in favor of developing one. That is because if you don't have that, it's very difficult to solve the problem of CO2 sustainability. Because to solve this problem, you have to give the possibility for this country to do that. Thank you very much. It was an enormous pleasure to be with all of you.
Thank you so much. Well, what a great start, and that emphasis on the problems of asymmetry and the need for a more symmetrical approach, I think, is really spot on. So we're going to turn to our next panelist in a moment, who is Chukwuemere Okereke from Nigeria, who I think will give us an African perspective on some of these challenges. So could I, in the meantime, just remind everybody that you can raise your questions and comments, and please put them in the Q&A, and then they will sit there and we'll pick them up after all the panelists have spoken. But for now, without further ado, let me hand over to Chukwuemere Okereke. Over to you now.
Thank you very much, Melissa. Thank you, IDDRI, for the invitation. And thank you to Pasi for the very clear and provocative keynote speech. It is my pleasure an honor actually, to be sharing the platform with all these distinguished panelists. And I think the topic that we are considering today is also very, very timely and crucial. I would try to be even shorter than the time that have been allocated, so that we can hopefully allow more time to hear the voice of the students and for interaction. The question before us is, how do we reform multilateralism to account especially for planetary boundaries and sustainability? And then I think that I'm gonna perhaps just go very along the lines that Melissa has said, the excellent point that she's made in her opening remarks, and which has been clearly endorsed by Mario in his comments. From an African perspective, the central question, there are two key questions that I think border Africa in terms of multilateralism in the context of sustainable development. The first one is that there seems to be increasing focus on addressing the environmental degradation that is confronting the globe, but not addressing the human development aspect that is very intimately tied with that environmental degradation. And so when you look at the way that multilateralism has been developing in recent times, whether you're thinking of carbon or environmental issue area, the emphasis has been on the environmental side, but environmental sustainability or sustainable development is supposed to have three aspects to it: the social, the environmental, and the economical. And so a powerful and important way or basis for the reform of multilateralism has to be to upgrade the conversation of human development as an integral aspect of sustainable development or environmental sustainability. And one critical or practical way through which this can be done is to elevate the issue of economic rights as a major focus of conversation in multilateral forum. At the moment, the West tend to emphasize political rights, and those are quite important. But they do not give as much emphasis to economic rights, right to food, right to social protection, right to a safe environment. And I think that emphasizing the economic and social rights will be a very good place to start in the reform of multilateralism. The second area that needs attention, which has already been well highlighted, is the issue of asymmetry, justice. I think that the problem or the essential challenge in multilateralism is asymmetry, the issue of asymmetry, as Mario and Melissa have been telling us. The deep connection between justice and climate change resides really in 4 dimensions of asymmetry. Number one is asymmetry in contribution. A lot of the conversation, for example, about net zero, which I support, is good. But when you are talking about net zero without factoring in historic warming, then you are actually amassing to yourself quite a huge chunk of grandparenting or grandfather rights, which makes it quite difficult to have an open conversation about historic responsibility and what that means going forward. We also have asymmetry in impact, where those that are traditionally or historically responsible for climate change are not the ones that are bearing the greatest brunt of it. The huge number of people that are going to be displaced by climate change, the climate impact on the development of Africa, are just few examples of how the continent that is least responsible for climate change is bearing the brunt. And we are not having enough conversation on the impact of climate change and the need for those that have caused this problem to pick more of the bill for solving the problem. And then, of course, we have asymmetry in voice. The fact that those, again, that are feeling the brunt of climate change and that have contributed the least to it are not effectively represented in the rooms around the tables where critical decisions about how to take the policies forward are made. And so it will be important to reform multilateralism to give Africans more voice around the table. A practical suggestion that had been made recently, had been made quite a long time, but really gained currency more recently, is, for example, the idea that African Union should be admitted into the G20 so that we can add about 1.4 billion voices or representation in the table around the table where important economic decisions are made. We have the EU, for example, as part of the G20, and it does make sense to have Africa around that table. Then we also have deficiency in voices in the IMF, for example, IMF Governing Board. Melissa has highlighted that. But in the UN security system, for example, where we continue to have 5 permanent members and, of course, 10 non-permanent members. And I think it's important to reform these multilateral structures so that there will be much greater representation of Africans. Another key area where I think reform is needed is in the the sort of economic rules governing trade. I do know that, for example, the total amount of illicit flows from Africa 2 years ago was 67.6 billion. This is many times more than the loans Africa received and more than the OECD official aid. It is certainly also more than the amount of money that is coming from Africa, from diaspora to Africa in form of remittance. And the same applies to even the so-called legal repatriations of profit, which again is about 57 billion US dollar. Again, multiple times more than the loan that Africa receives and more than the amount that comes to Africa in form of FDI. And so we see that there are some analysis that suggest that for every $1 that Africa receives, Africa gives back the West about $11. And we need to reform the economic structure so that it can offer a better playing field. And one other area that I think is vital is the area of interest rates. Mario has suggested, alluded to that. But for about the 17 or so trillion dollars that the West spent trying to fight COVID, a lot of that money was borrowed in near zero interest rate. But Africa continues to be saddled with huge amount of interest rates when it comes to borrowing. This makes it difficult for Africa to mobilize the necessary resources that they need to pursue their economic development. And so hopefully with time, I think Melissa is trying to urge me to stop, but with time, we can maybe dig into some of this a bit more. But I think it's also important to stress that where Africa needs, emphasizes that they need a bit more of a reform is in the role of transnational organizations. Often we tend to focus on the role of states, which is all well and good in a multilateral setting. But increasingly in the West, we see non-state actors performing important diplomatic roles. And here I think that African voice is almost non-existent. And this is one area where some kind of reform is also necessary to accommodate greater non-state voices from Africa in multilateral circles. I'll leave it there for now.
Okay, thank you so much. And I think that emphasis both on economy and on looking beyond the UN systems to some of these other multilateral-like organizations is really critically important. So thank you so much there. Right, so moving straight on, we now have Amrita Nalika from the German Institute for Global and Area Studies. So Amrita, over to you.
Thank you very much, Melissa. And hello, everyone from Hamburg. Congratulations to IDDRI on its big anniversary. It is a pleasure to join you all today to mark this occasion, and doubly so by addressing this important question of reforming multilateralism together. So I will now make 3 points. I'll say something briefly on the seriousness of the threats to multilateralism. I'll then highlight 2 emerging narratives on reforming multilateralism. And third, I'll say something on what should come next. So first, the threats. So yes, earlier this year, President Biden promised us America is back. And Chancellor Merkel told us, I quote, the prospects for multilateralism are much better now than they were 2 years ago, end of quote. In fact, we know this relief was premature. The tragedy unfolding in Afghanistan is a painful reminder of the failures of multilateralism and also missing American leadership. The sins of omission and commission of the World Health Organization in its handling of the COVID-19 pandemic has already provided us with examples of the damage that flawed multilateralism can contribute to. Vaccine nationalism remains a persistent and multifaceted problem. Rampant globalization, nurtured by one of the organizations that I study, the World Trade Organization, and other international organizations, rampant globalization nurtured by these organizations and pursued as a panacea for all problems has fostered global value chains that lack reliability. Multilateralism is really, really not in the best of health, and it needs all the help it can get. So how might these threats be addressed? And this brings me to my second point. There's a rich debate on reforming multilateralism underway, and it boils down to two competing narratives. How this contestation plays out will be crucial in determining the future of the multilateral order. And narratives, just to be clear, are much more than communication. They are the causal stories that people tell themselves and others, and thereby help shape policy action and public behavior. So what are these two narratives on reforming multilateralism? The first one is of resuscitate and reinforce. The second is a fundamental restructuring. Resuscitate and reinforce. This is the narrative that one tends to hear in the Brussels bubble, or indeed in Geneva. Within governments, ministries mandated to deal with trade, finance, and development issues tend to have a sympathy with this narrative. Epistemically, this narrative relies on the writings, especially of trade lawyers and economists. The fault, as per this narrative, lies not in multilateralism itself, but in its misuse and abuse by powerful states, such as the US in the Trump era. The solution lies in strengthening the institutions of multilateralism, meaning increasing funding for the WHO, meaning having more free trade, not less, within the WTO rules. This narrative is universal in embrace. For example, when Sabine Weiland, even when dealing with the partner, competitor, rival that is China, tweeted, "There is no alternative to engagement with regard to the comprehensive agreement on investment." This narrative recognizes the importance of values, but more along the lines of labor standards and environmental standards. And if you want to see this narrative in its best light, it's probably a narrative that wants to avoid rocking the boat in an already precarious sea. Now, that's the first narrative. The second narrative is a fundamental restructuring. The argument goes, the practices of multilateralism will need to be rebooted. Its institutions will need to be redesigned before they can be entrusted with more authority. Unlike the first narrative, this narrative does not see an opposition between putting one's own country first and multilateral cooperation. If anything, it sees a strong and robust base at home as a necessary condition for the practice of effective and legitimate multilateralism. It's very easy to dismiss this narrative as a crude pursuit of nothing more than narrow national interests. In fact, prominent variants of this narrative also entail a strong commitment to values. Values matter. If one wants to rebuild supply chains in a reliable way for strategic products, which in turn requires deeper levels of integration with like-minded and trustworthy allies. And values in this second narrative, in contrast to the first, are conceptualized in much broader terms, such as democracy and liberalism. Variants of this second narrative of fundamental restructuring live in political circles in some national capitals. The Biden administration has embraced some of its traits. Within countries in the global north, the restructuring narrative finds greater resonance in ministries dealing with foreign affairs and defense. Its supporters include NGOs, activists concerned about human rights violations, freedom of the press, rule of law, and so forth. Now, there are ways in which these competing narratives can be reconciled, and I'm happy to go into this later. But no matter how prettily we reconcile these narratives, two things will be necessary. And this brings me to my third point, my final point, what should come next? And for limitations of time, I will mention just two. First, much of the debate on reforming multilateralism is solid, but very technocratic. And it comes across as really divorced from real people. If we are unable to make multilateralism work for real people and also show that it works for them, no solution, however perfect, will suffice. This means engaging with domestic populations within developed countries, states from the world regions, non-state actors and civil society actors from the global south, transnational civil society, at each step of this narrative of reforming multilateralism, then the act of reforming multilateralism, and also being able to show how the benefits permeate to the individual level, as was emphasized also by our excellent keynote speaker today. My second point, what needs to be done? A lot of the engagement that we have with the global south, I use that as a shorthand right now, the engagement that we have with the global south is from above, right? So when we in Europe or North America engage with the global south, we often tend to this not eye to eye. We seem to be operating under the assumption that we in the West are somehow the guardians of values of pluralism, liberalism, democracy, and more, which we're somehow willing to teach the rest. This is deeply, deeply problematic, not only in normative terms, but also in terms of realpolitik. With this high-handed attitude, we often fail to recognize potential friends and allies in the global south, some of which actually have traditions of liberalism and pluralism that sometimes predate European ones. And it's only by engaging with diverse actors from the global south that we will be able to reform multilateralism in an equitable and sustainable way. I'll stop there, and perhaps in Q&A, I would be very happy to pick up also on some of the questions that the previous speakers raised on trade, on the World Trade Organization, and also bring in India, which I didn't get a chance to talk about, but perhaps later. Thank you.
Okay, Amrita, thank you so much. That was really excellent, and especially hearing those two narratives. And we might see if there are further narratives out there as well, something that we could pick up on in the discussion too. So turning now to Adele Thomas, Director of Climate Change Adaptation and Resilience Research Center in the Bahamas, for a perspective perhaps from a small island state environment. So Adele, over to you.
Thank you, and thanks for the invitation to be on this panel. So when we think about multilateralism from the small island developing state, or SIDS perspective, what I think is currently missing and what needs to be a central principle is justice. And so today I have 4 main points. Firstly, I'm going to provide some background on the current state of SIDS and climate change in particular. Secondly, I'm going to provide some historical contextualization on how we have gotten to this point. Thirdly, I'll highlight how the current multilateral system is far from adequate to deal with these injustices that we are experiencing. And then lastly, all of this underscores why we need to have a focus on justice in a transformed multilateral system. So firstly, the current state of SIDS and climate change is alarming and incredibly inequitable. SIDS contribute the least to the greenhouse gas emissions that drive climate change. So less than 1% of total global emissions come from SIDS, but yet small islands are consistently recognized as being on the front lines. In the Caribbean region, which is where I'm from, we have been experiencing increasing intensities of hurricanes, where the damages have escalated into billions of dollars per event. And this has required many countries to borrow externally to address these escalating threats, and it has contributed to escalating levels of debt. So indeed, 2 of the 10 world's most indebted countries are small islands in the Caribbean. And just to give you a small example of how result in rising debt, in 2017, Hurricane Maria caused $1.3 billion of damages in Dominica, and that was 226% of the country's GDP. And this came only 2 years after another tropical storm, which had caused damages of 96% of GDP. And so these very expensive storms back to back resulted in a very sharp deterioration of fiscal performance, in decreased tax revenue, the increased expenditure of public funds for rehabilitation and reconstruction, and of course, increased external debt. And so this case of Dominica really exemplifies the constant repair and recovery cycles and debt accumulation from extreme weather events that challenge SIDS. It shows the severe burden that SIDS face by being repeatedly set back by expensive climate impacts that take money and resources away from sustainable development. And projections show that as global temperatures rise, so will the intensity of climate impacts, including hurricanes, and the damages that they cause will also escalate. And so it's like being given a boat with a hole in the bottom, placed in the ocean in the middle of a storm, and then you're given a bucket to try and remove the water. You will eventually fail and sink. And so now for a bit of historical contextualization. Where did this boat with the hole in the bottom come from? If you look at what makes SIDS so vulnerable to climate change and to achieving sustainable development, there are a number of structural characteristics. And these include high levels of debts, which we talked about, concentration of people and assets along the coastline, and dependence on sectors that are tied to environmental conditions. And so these are sectors such as tourism, fisheries, and agriculture, for which many SIDS rely on for the vast majority of their GDP. But these structural characteristics that we see in SIDS are not just coincidental. They have a historical background. These patterns of development were put in place by our colonizers. Colonizers established cities and settlements along the coast where it was easy to export extracted resources. And they established these industries of agriculture and fisheries to extract these resources and relied on imported slave labor after indigenous people were killed off. And so tourism was an industry that many SIDS had to rely on as they gained independence from colonizers in order to compete as independent countries in a vastly inequitable global trading system. And so the very characteristics of SIDS that make us so vulnerable to climate change have this deep historical and unjust background. And so for SIDS that have only relatively recently gained independence, it is formidable to be confronted with reducing such deeply ingrained vulnerabilities to climate change. If we look at the current multilateral system to address climate change in particular, then we can see where these current and historical injustices are not being considered. SIDS have been advocating from the very inception of the United Nations Framework on Climate Change that there need to be provisions in place for loss and damage, which are the negative impacts of climate change that SIDS experience disproportionately. However, loss and damage has been virtually ignored in the UN and the Paris Agreement. Multiple reviews of loss and damage in the UN have found that there are significant deficits in support and action. Loss and damage is not even an agenda item that is up for discussion. There is no dedicated finance for loss and damage. It's a taboo subject that is immediately met with defensive approaches. And so although we have scientific evidence that we are experiencing these negative impacts due to climate change and that they are rising, loss and damage is still treated as a taboo and highly political subject instead of actually being addressed as a major issue that is affecting SIDS in other vulnerable countries. And ignoring current and historical injustices has allowed former colonizers and industrialized countries to place loss and damage on the back burner. It has resulted in deaths and damages and suffering that can be prevented. So what is needed to change this? We need a just approach to multilateralism as it relates to climate change and sustainable development in particular. Climate justice is a framework which highlights that the causes and impacts of climate change are neither distributed nor experienced equally, and that there are structural, systemic, and historical factors that have led to these inequities. Incorporating principles of climate justice into the multilateral system would require countries that have been most responsible for climate change and who have also historically benefited being also responsible for dealing with the impacts of climate change. And this would require a shift from providing inadequate support to actually addressing the needs of SIDS and other vulnerable countries. Climate finance and support should no longer be looked at as charity, but should be framed as standing in solidarity with those that have been most affected by climate change and actually addressing their needs. And so there are the Bali principles of climate justice, which offer some comprehensive core principles that may underpin this focus on justice in the multilateral system. And one of the key principles is that the rights of victims of climate change should be protected and that they should receive full compensation, restoration, and reparation for loss of land, livelihood, and other damages. And the whole issue of liability and compensation for climate impacts has been a major sticking point in the multilateral system. But the multilateral system has also shown that failing to consider liability and compensation has not resulted in an outpouring of support or solidarity. And so as SIDS are increasingly affected by climate impacts, and there continues to be minimal assistance provided, the climate justice narrative and the need for reparative justice in particular is growing. And so in closing, I think that the multilateral system desperately needs a transformation, and this transformation needs to be underpinned by climate justice to address current and historical inequities that have been borne by SIDS. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was an incredibly powerful statement, actually, and it makes me wonder whether these principles of climate justice are ones which one might take into questions of justice in the transformation of multilateralism more generally, around questions perhaps of health justice or social justice or economic justice. Anyway, I leave that for the Q&A. But let's turn now, last but not least, to our panelist from China, Sun Yishan, to talk to us about the role of China in the global governance scene, a role that's incredibly important and changing very fast. So looking forward to hearing from you.
Thank you, Melissa, and many thanks for IDDRI for inviting me to join this wonderful panel. So I was asked to provide a Chinese perspective on the reform of multilateralism. I think this is a very challenging task. So I would like to focus my interventions on the changing role of China in multilateralism, especially in the area of sustainable development and climate change, and also highlight some recent trends in China's global economic engagement, and especially how China is trying to embed sustainability norms in its global engagement. And hopefully, after my interventions, this can trigger some of your thoughts on the future of multilateralism. So let's start with China's engagement in multilateralism. Over the past half century, we have seen that China has increasingly engaged in multilateral institutions since it was admitted by the United Nations in 1971. And due to the size of the country and also its status of United Nations Security Council permanent members, China has always played a very important role in various multilateral rulemaking processes, including a range of environmental agreements and treaties. China has also emphasized its identity of developing countries and stay in the relevant blocks in different negotiations to support developing countries. Historically, this led China to stress the importance of balancing different pillars of sustainable development, especially the rights of economic development. However, in the past 2 decades, what we have seen, there is some change in China's role and engagement in various multilateral environmental institutions, mainly due to the rapid economic development of the countries and subsequent environmental impacts that China has made on the global environment. An important example is climate change. So in 1997, when global community made the Kyoto Protocol, China was listed as a non-Annex 1 countries without binding target on emission reduction. Because by then, the emission was not that significant, but 10 years after, China has become the largest emitter of greenhouse gases, and the pressure was suddenly on China to make a binding commitment in 2009 at COP15 in Copenhagen, and the failure of making a new legally binding agreement led a lot of criticism on China. And as a result of all these changes, what we have seen in the past 20 years is that China has gradually changed its position with respect to many environmental issues in multilateral arena. And this has led China to become more actively promote environmental protection and also multilateral institution buildings. And some examples including China's strong support in the negotiation of the 2030 Agenda on Sustainable Development and also subsequent implementation processes of the SDGs. And we can see China has not only identified the SDG as an important task for its domestic development as part of its development plans, but also identified as a key tasks in its international development cooperation. And this has also reflected in China's constructive role on the road to the climate COP in Paris, and which led to the success of the Paris Agreement. As we can see that the willingness of China to make a new legally binding treaty before the Paris COP was really important. And also on other environmental issues, for example, biological diversity. Today, and the Conference of Parties, the 15th Conference of Parties of CBD is had in China, and the Chinese President Xi Jinping announced in the opening ceremony that China will establish an international fund of $230 million to support developing nations to protect biodiversity. There are definitely various drivers of these changes. So externally, we can attribute to international pressures, both from the global north, but also global south, because of China's growing impact in the world due to its foreign investment and trade, and also China's unwillingness to be a responsible player in multilateral arena. But internally, there are also growing public attention to environmental issues, and also China has seen the limits on economic growth, and which led the country's leadership to stress more importance of sustainable development and environmental protection. And more importantly, such shift was especially salient in the past decades, especially after the President Xi Jinping became the leadership of the countries. We know Xi always emphasized the environmental protection and also promoted the idea or the concept of ecological civilization. Now it's in the China's constitutions, but also in terms of China's global engagement, what we have seen is China continues to support various multilateral institutions, but also trying to initiate some new platforms or mechanisms to promote a more inclusive international cooperation and global governance. In this process, it's also trying to promote green development or sustainability. One important example that I want to highlight, and also I've been studying for quite a while in the past few years, is the Belt and Road Initiative, which is a flagship foreign policy project of Xi Jinping. And it includes 5 key areas, including infrastructure development, integrated trade, financial integration, policy coordination, and also people-to-people connectivities. They are the 5 connectivities in the Belt and Road Initiative. And with respect to sustainability and environmental governance, what we have seen is China has begun to embed existing sustainability norms into the Belt and Road Initiative. In 2007, the Chinese government has published a high-level policy guidance on Green Belt and Road Initiative to identify environmental stewardship as a key principle of the Belt and Road Initiative, and also made the plan on how to promote green development in the Belt and Road Initiative. And more practically, what we have seen is through the Belt and Road Initiative, China has also emphasized and trying to make efforts to link the Belt and Initiatives with existing sustainability norms, but also trying to create some new practices and norms. Here, what China has emphasized is a dialogue-based approach built on mutual respect and benefits. One specific examples in the building of Green Belt and Road Initiative is the establishment of the Belt and Road Initiative International Green Development Coalition, led by China, but in cooperation with existing multilateral institutions such as United Nations environmental programs, but also stakeholders in both recipient countries and also from the global north. So it's more like a multi-stakeholder initiative to coordinate the policy. And this is actually a very important new trend in terms of China's engagement in multilateral efforts to promote sustainable development. What we have seen in the past, that China often supports the multilateral institutions, but not really through this transnational multi-stakeholder initiatives. Therefore, what we could expect is that in the future, China is likely to take more and more the lead in developing such new multilateral rules based on China's knowledge and experiences. So looking ahead, it is clear that China will continue to support existing multilateral institutions and play an increasingly active role in supporting global efforts to combat climate change and promote sustainable development. And this has been also reflected by the recent pledge that China has made to stop finance a new coal power plants abroad, but also as we have identified in China's efforts to develop new transnational multi-stakeholder initiative, is that more and more Chinese actors, not necessarily state actors, but also non-state actors, are likely to become more active to promote these new practices and norms. And this may increase some kind of fragmentations in terms of multilateral efforts, but it also trigger a ratchet mechanism to lead everyone to make more ambitious actions to promote sustainable development and climate actions. I think I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Another really powerful presentation. And I think this sense of the Belt and Road Initiative as an example of a different geography of transnationalism, in a way, of multilateralism, is a very, very interesting one. So now we're going to open up for questions. So if I might ask all the panelists, please, to put their cameras back on, and Passy also, so we can remind ourselves of who our speakers were. And we'll take a round of questions from the Q&A, but I think starting from those posed by one of the Sciences Po students. So I'll be open to your questions. And what we'll do is take a selection of questions, and then I'll come back to the panel, perhaps in the original order and starting with Pasi, for you to pick up on the ones that are relevant that you'd like to respond to. And then if we have time, we'll have another round in the same way. So do we have Eleonora Bonnell, who was going to ask some questions from Sciences Po?
Yes, hello, can you hear me?
Yes, wonderful.
Okay, perfect. Thank you for your very illuminating speeches. And I had a first question prepared precisely on trade. And so I'm happy that this was an issue that came up. So from the perspective of the least well-off, some have argued that multilateralism through trade and the World Trade Organization has actually failed. So how can multilateralism shift from a focus on trade to a fairer focus that accounts for climate and redistribution concerns? And are these two necessarily a dichotomy, or are there other ways of looking at this?
Okay, excellent. I think that's a really good question. So extending from trade to other issues. There's then another question that's come through, which again, I think very well put, says resymmetrizing power. So this is something that several of you talked about in international relations, assumes that those who have the power will agree to reduce their power. Isn't that counterintuitive? What pathways do you see for that to happen? So I think that's actually a really good question as well. Will those who currently hold the power agree to give it up or reduce it? Do we have any others at this point?
A second question.
Oh, you have a second question. Lovely.
Yes,
okay,
yes.
Let's see your second question as well.
Okay. So you've spoken about Latin America, and which can be identified as one of the most unequal regions in the world. So what are the necessary expectations to change the international discourse on systemic racism, and so the link between environmental change and racial justice? And do you think this implies a shift in responsibility for the...
Okay, that's great. So justice, and particularly racial justice and injustice. Good. Well, let's take a few more. So I'm seeing now another in the chat. Wait a moment. Yeah, so which would be, what might be the view of Indian players about what needs to change in the multilateral system? So I think that was one that perhaps Amrita might pick up on in particular when we get to that point, because she did mention that. Okay. Another one is, how willing might China be about the possibility to resymmetrize the trade and economic engine along the lines proposed by Mario Cimoli? So that's really related to that earlier question about giving up power, and perhaps a particular question about China. And is there one more at this stage, or shall we go back? Wait a moment. Okay. Yeah, there's one more, which is from Ariadna Anisimov, who's saying, interested to hear the panel's views on post-colonial legacies in small islands and the effects of this on multilateralism. I think you've talked about this a bit, but things like dependency pathways shaped by loans for reconstructing post-extreme events. So a little bit more perhaps on how we can help support small islands to move away from focusing on tourism and this kind of trap. What other economic solutions might there be? So that's a group of questions. And then finally, there's one more for Amrita saying, would you please present your third solution? So I don't know if that's about the two narratives and whether there's a third narrative. Okay, so look, that's a set of questions. Let me now go back to the panel in order. So some of them were directed at you in particular, but some of them are a little bit more general. And you might in your remarks also, if there are any reflections that you'd like to offer on the other presentations that you heard, please, this is an opportunity for that as well, so we can get this going as a little bit of a conversation. Otherwise, so I'll turn first to Mario. Any responses to these questions, and perhaps particularly the asymmetry point, since it's the one that you raised so very clearly at the start?
Thank you very much. Thank you, all of you. Really, I think most of the presentation direction, we are worried about to rebuild multilaterals on the real and solid basis. That's, I think, we have a common agreement. Reading from different sides, I think that is very important, and I'm happy to be here because I think the view that we have in that sense about resymmetrizing power, I think that is a crucial point, because that is difficult, because it's distribution of power that is that has different level of point. For example, take the case of financing for development. If you have a control of more institutional financial system that is controlled by a power that is difficult to take to modify the situation. For example, if you have a United States, if you have Europe, if you have for one part the Federal Reserve, or for the other side you have the Central Bank, that creates an enormous difference of power in the capability to realize the macroeconomics and trade policies. That is a point, crucial variable to take into consideration. What is important in this distribution of power is to take a seat and to discuss about the need that the planet is unique, because if you don't modify that, it's difficult to have the opportunity for developed economies. Take the case of China, is the same. We need to rediscuss with China, to say together and to rethink how is the new roadmap for development, taking clearly more sustainable history. Because today China is demanding more carbon, and mineral fields. That's, everything we discuss and develop the economy to sustain employment and equality using the old sources of energy. That is a problem. That is a problem. What you say, how we transform it. This is required to reasymmetrizing power. Reasymmetrizing power, first of all, has to be discussed, and not discussed because we want a nice world, beautiful, every people is loving each other, peace out. No, because you have to discuss trade, financial for development, and given the possibility to develop an economy to transform their economy. Because when you say how take this point, it's difficult, because if you have the pressure of 50% of person that is in informality, these people want jobs. It's not matter which type of job, it's job. You don't stay in Paris, you don't stay in Berlin, you don't stay in Milan, you don't stay in Washington, DC, and so on. You stay in countries that have this informality. How you explain to the people, no, you stay informal because we need to transform the structure. No, you need to give jobs. And that is very important. There, in this context, what to understand developed economy, and where there is the more concentration in power, is that this solution is not only good for developing economies and for middle income, it's also good for developed economy. If you want to transform your economy, it's not only that you create the circular economy in the middle of Berlin. Of course, that is nice. But the people, what is created in the other part of the world, require this long view. And I want to take trade. Trade is a crucial issue, because if you give the possibility to middle income economies and developing economies to access to market, that is a problem. But to access to market, you need to transfer technology and creating together capability. As could be the case of vaccine, it didn't happen. That is my point. That's my point. Redistribution of power required is very important. Redistribution and reasymmetrize. I like very much the word that you said, Melissa, that is very good. Reasymmetrizing power is the crucial issue. Multilateral has to build up about this resymmetrizing power. About Latin America, that is the point. You put clearly. Many of the policy making in Latin America is going back because they need energy, because you can explain when you have so immigration pressure in Mexico, how you have this poverty pressure in Brazil, or you have the peripheral cities in this region. I think it's the same in Africa. People want jobs, want quality of job, want income, want guarantee of income. That's the problem that you have today. How you compatibilize that requires resymmetrizing power. I think is very important. There is part of power that can be discussed. This is the role of the United Nations, I think. Okay. There is another one. For example, the central bank have to understand that.
Okay, good, great. So I see now that Pasi has joined us again. So Pasi, I'll turn back to you next. I hope you were able to hear some of the questions that were raised, and also this is a chance for you if you'd like to comment on any of the things you heard from the other panelists. So over to you for any responses or remarks you'd like to make at this point.
Didn't catch very well the question. Maybe someone.
Okay. Well, there was one important question about if we're looking for greater justice or symmetry in the multilateral system, how can we expect the players that are currently powerful perhaps to give up their power, and how might that happen? There was also a question about how one sees racial injustice as being embedded in multilateral systems at the moment, and what we might do to transform that. But I just also wondered if you wanted to come back on anything that you'd heard from the other panelists in relation to your talk. So just anything you'd like to contribute at this stage.
Yes, I think one of the panelists said something I've realized in my speech about the respect of human rights and putting human being on the center of all the action we can do in this cooperation between countries. And I think for me, this is very, very important. As I've said, in the DRC, we have so many we have so many resources, and I believe that, you know, we can use those resources not only to develop some countries, but to make sure that this cooperation can be for the benefit of all of us. And this is a very important question, because I think we have in the DRC so many mineral sites, for example. We have so many multilateralists who are currently working and exploiting like different resources. But for me, it's very painful sometimes when you see the gap or the contrast between the resources we have in the country and the poverty in which people are living in. And I think it's a shame, you know, when we talk about the global cooperation and the global governance, when there is such as kind of gap and contrast between the situation people are living in different countries. When I'm, for example, in Europe, as I have got the chance to travel in Europe, in the US, sometimes when I'm there, we have access, you know, full time to electricity, to internet, you know, even for me to be connected here, the internet is really very poor. And yeah, sometimes there is no electricity. We use generator to be connected. And I think when we see all the resources we have in the country, I think the cooperation should also be the way we have, not like to have to help each other, like aids, but you know, to really work together on how we can face different challenges we are facing as countries. Because for me, there is no Africa, Europe, US. I think we are global, and we are like one country, and we have to be human and to make sure that human beings are in the center of our action and human rights are respected. Because it's not only in Congo where the situation is like it is. In so many other countries, the situation is the same, is very, very bad. In Afghanistan, in all those other countries where the situation is really bad. But I think at the global level, we have to think on sustainable solution to all those problems, so that you know, we go on the same line with the same objectives. You know, trying to work together to find solutions. Yeah.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. So now to Chukwuemeka, any questions any of those questions that you'd like to pick up?
Sure. The question on trade is very vital. Emissions associated with the production of internationally traded goods and services account for up to 33% of global emissions. So the question about trade is crucial. However, whether international trade drives or decreases global GHG emissions depends on a number of different factors, including emission intensity of traded products, as well as finance or influence of international trade on the location of trade and the rules of trade. But there could be a number of policy responses to cope with carbon leakage, and these include border carbon adjustment, differentiated carbon tax schemes. Some other options include leveling of the cost of carbon paid by consumers on products, which can be designed in line of WTO rule. But there are conversations around also leveling of cost of emission trading schemes, which could pose problems for WTO rules. All proposals could involve some difficulty of tracing and verification. Now, from a consumption perspective, high-income developed countries typically tend to be net importers of emissions, whereas low and middle-income developing countries tend to be net exporters. That this is shifting. But then it poses a significant problem with some kinds of accounting where some developed countries will say, oh, we are very much on the way to net zero, only because they are not accounting for their consumption-based emission. And this could potentially lead to a condition or a situation where some highly developed countries will claim victory in reducing their emissions and then bring pressure to bear on poor countries to reduce their emission because of particular style or method of accounting for responsibility. So fundamentally, there is no prima facie tension between trade, but it is actually the rules and how the accounting is done. But it is possible to imagine a situation where the accounting rules are done in a way that favors the rich country and further disadvantages the poor countries. Going back to this issue of the rules of the game, the power asymmetry. And in terms of whether it is illogical to imagine a resymmetrization of power, the answer is no. I mean, remember we did have slave trade, which now has more or less stopped. We have other violent issues of human rights which have been challenged globally. What is required is for the players to understand that the issue of justice and equity is actually in the interest of a global peace and prosperity. This doesn't mean that the people will give up their power easily,
but requires a new set of consciousness, values, activism, advocacy to force this to happen. And it seems to me that there are areas where we can point to and say that we're actually moving in the right direction, but the change has been too slow, and requires that we continue to mount pressure to achieve greater symmetry.
Okay, wonderful. Great responses there, and really drawing out that importance of global solidarity, maybe overriding power asymmetries. So I think now I will turn to Amrita. There were a couple of questions there specifically for you, so if you could pick up on those.
Okay, thank you. And Sebastian, can I please come back? These are just such great questions from the students. So I'll speak fast because you gave me so much food for thought. There are 4 that I picked up on. The first one from Eleonora, and I'll continue on trade. The second one on resymmetrizing power. The third one, my solution, the third solution. Fourth, the Indian, what does India want from multilateralism? So Eleonora, and the move away from trade and the focus on development, to build on those excellent points that my co-panelists just made, I'll take it in a different angle now, fully on board with what has already been said. Remember the Doha Development Agenda? That turned out to be a remarkable failure. It was launched with the best of intentions. Developing countries were at the heart of the decision-making process, right? The WTO is one of the very few organizations that adapted way more than IMF or World Bank or the UN Security Council, right? Developing countries were at the heart of decision-making. What we got was deadlock after deadlock, which is not the fault of developing countries, just to be clear, right? That it's about flawed processes. And the Doha Development Agenda was supposed to correct the injustices, the imbalances of the Uruguay round. And it was supposed to be launched 2001, supposed to be completed in 2005. Everybody sort of, nobody wants to say it's dead. Everybody knows it's been dead for a while, right? This is a very depressing situation. And you also saw the domestic consequences of this, right? The misuse of the trade agenda, for example, by Trump, right? Trade was such an easy scapegoat. There are lots of reasons why people were losing jobs in certain areas in the US, which had to do with technological developments, lack of a good support system, lack of welfare mechanisms, good transition mechanisms, but no, it was all about trade. This is really problematic. So we have a case where justice was tried, it didn't work. Now, nonetheless, I'm very hopeful. And so we heard about the mechanism of global solidarity, right? And that's why we should be cooperating. Yes, that is one. But there is another one too, which is that now some of the challenges that states are facing are so severe, right? And they have to do with geoeconomics, the linkage between trade and security, the weaponization of interdependence. And for this reason, and I don't think anybody wants to go into isolationism, right? If we do that, we will lose the many gains that we have made in terms of lifting millions of people out of poverty. Nobody wants isolationism. So instead, what we are going to get is turn to closer allies, a shift in production, building closely integrated, reliable supply chains, particularly in certain strategic sectors. That's where allies become very important, right? And those are allies also from the Global South. And this is something that the Global South should also harness. So we should use the normative arguments that we have heard, very much so, but also use the ones that are interest-based, because it's in the interest of the Global North now more than ever to be engaging. That leads me to my third solution. Marie-Paul, thank you for that question. I'll be very brief here, but the third solution is one that involves variable geometry. I've already started taking you in this direction right now when I talked about deeply integrated supply chains amongst reliable partners, right? Restructured supply chains. That doesn't mean that you have a closed system, right? What it means is you have an open system, but a tight set of rules where you have deep integration, And then you can think about it as a concentric circles model. You can think about it as a variation of plurilaterals, but combining the trade and security dimensions. I've written about this. I can send you some references later. And last but not least, India. What does India want from the system? And India is really caught up in a bind, right? Because on the one hand, you have India with China right next door, very concerned about what is happening in the Indo-Pacific, very concerned about what's happening in the Taiwan Straits, very concerned about what's happening on its own border, right? On the one hand. On the other hand, if you look at India in the World Trade Organization, India and China are working very closely together on things like special and differential treatment, right? There are many proposals that India will put forth that are with China, and so it's complex. So let me give you two issue areas. One is trade. And here on trade, India has always been a difficult partner. India's been very reluctant. I mean, there are reams and reams that have been written on this. Even now, there was a report in the FT on how difficult India is being on trade negotiations. But you go back to some of the objections that India had, for example, on stockpiling and food security. Now, some of that doesn't look that ridiculous anymore, right? Because the defense, now when people are talking about reforming the WTO, they're saying, well, maybe we need to have a system where we can have stockpiles of certain essential products because we have seen some of the risks that disruption to global supply chains can do. So India continues to be very cautious on trade liberalization, as it has always been. But the time has changed, and so circumstances have changed, right, in the world of weaponized interdependence. I think that's interesting. Climate is an area where India's change in position, I find, again, very remarkable. So India used to be always very defensive, right? Always on the back foot, always, we're not going to give up economic development for mitigation. But what's happened is India has started owning the mitigation and adaptation agenda. And it's been doing this by appealing to traditions, right? Going back to ancient texts and building a consensus. And this is where domestic politics is really important. You have to take your people with you. No, I mean, you can come up with great multilateral solutions. We all can work together. But if you don't have your people with you, that's not going to fly. And on climate change, India has been taking its population with it. I'll stop there.
Good, thank you very much. Great responses there. So quickly now to Adele.
I wanted to touch on this thought of resymmetrizing. I think resymmetrizing assumes that there was one symmetry, and there was not. So like I mentioned in my interventions, since many small islands became independent relatively recently, the Bahamas, which is where I'm from, we gained our independence from the UK in 1973. We are less than 50 years old. So we entered as a country in a vastly inequitable system, and then you're forced to compete in this system that you've entered. So not resymmetrizing, but actually providing symmetry. I think this question on will, the people that have power and resources agree to give it up or to reduce it? I think we've seen the answer to that. It's no. And this is what, people are protesting against, is that the multilateral system, frankly, is not working. We've been seeing all of these migration of people, human security, infringement of human rights. I think we're quickly approaching a tipping point where the multilateral system is not going to be able, to deal with the increasing needs and demands of people. And so, we talk, and I'm really getting tired of being on panels and talking about all of this stuff and not seeing things happen. And I think we're going to quickly come to a point where people are going to demand change, and it's not going to happen through diplomatic channels of multilateralism. And I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you, Adele. And finally, Yishan.
Thanks for many thought-provoking questions. So I'll just try to be brief. I think I'd like to start with the question of giving up power. I think I really agree with what Adele said. It's not like resymmetrizing, because there was never symmetry in the past. But what we have seen in the past 2 years in the pandemic, it's really difficult for those who hold the power to give up the power. I think the example of China is very telling. It's mainly because of the rapid rise of China with its material power. We have seen a growing demand for China to take more responsibility from the global community. But you have to have your growth or certain basis as growing material power or state capability in order to be able to get more power. So I'm not that optimistic in that sense, but I think we need to work together, the global community, to think about how we can build a more equitable mechanism or platform and to be more inclusive. I think definitely we know the multilateral system is not inclusive enough, or it's far from being inclusive. And I think on that we have to think about how we can build some alternatives if we don't rely on existing multilateral system. But I think one example I would like to, or one argument I would like to put forward here is that we don't only rely on nation intergovernmental platforms or intergovernmental processes, so even the intergovernmental processes really engage closely with other processes. For example, the case of the Paris Agreement in the climate processes now really acknowledge the non-state and sub-state climate actions, try to also involve non-state and sub-state climate actors to make their contributions. So I think we have to think about the broader picture and to see how we can involve other actors together and build this more equitable global community. So I'll stop here and hope have more conversation on that.
Thank you very much, and thank you to all of you and to those who asked those very pertinent questions. So we're nearly out of time. I mean, I just wanted to say I found this an incredibly interesting and very powerful session, actually. And I think the takeaways for me are probably four. One is the need for our thoughts about the future of multilateralism to be thoroughly human-centered, people-centered, in the largest possible sense, and actually to have justice at their heart. I think the second is that there might therefore be learning to be had across different frameworks. So actually the thinking around climate justice, or indeed racial injustice and justice of late, has potentially given us some different framings, which we might now want to bring into some of those longer standing questions about multilateralism and economic justice, say, or social and economic rights. So cross-learning between frameworks, I think, is important. The third big takeaway, of course, is power. And I think in different ways, panelists have pointed to the deep asymmetries in the multilateral system, which, of course, reproduce the deep asymmetries in the structural politics and histories that have been part of the emergence of the world order as it currently is. And I think those asymmetries are thoroughly unsustainable. And so I think that really demands that as soon as we begin to think about new approaches, we have to do so in a way that really analyzes and takes power relations extremely seriously. Whether we're talking about reform, restructuring, or indeed alternatives. And I think we have heard about some interesting routes towards alternatives this afternoon, different geometries which are more regional or more translocal being amongst them, or perhaps slightly different geometries and geographies for dealing with different issues, but then linking up across them. And finally, I would come back to the point of non-state actors or civil society or citizens and citizen voice. And it's been a bit of an undercurrent, I think, in this afternoon's discussions about what scope an effective multilateral system or its alternatives must have to work with people, whether that's in the context of sovereign states or actually working across. Very much agree with Adele that if we don't find a way to accommodate citizen concerns and politics within formal frameworks, we will see them dealt with in other ways through protest. And we are, in fact, already seeing that. So maybe part of the future needs to be about taking protests and activism seriously, and actually thinking about new multilateralisms in a way that is far more political in its broadest sense, and not seeing reforms as something that can possibly happen through tweaks to bureaucracy. So anyway, this is, I know, the beginning of a really important conference, and there'll be opportunities to debate many of these and other questions over the next couple of days. So I'd just like to thank all of you for kicking it off in a really important and fascinating way, and to wish you all a very good rest of the day, and to wish IDDRI a very successful rest of the conference. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Melissa. You did a really great job to facilitate this panel, and thank you very much to all the panelists. I just intervene again to just tell you that we can reconvene in half an hour for a debate between Deepesh Chakrabarty from the University of Chicago and Isabella Teixeira, who is the co-chair of the International Resources Panel and the former Environment Minister of Brazil. It will be facilitated by Anna Katarina Hornich from the German Development Institute. Thank you again very much.